The silence of the apartment was a heavy, suffocating blanket. It was not a peaceful quiet, but the hollow sound of absence, the ghost of a life that had vanished. Every piece of furniture was gone, sold for a pittance to strangers who didn't know the stories held within the wood. The only thing left was the faint, ghostly outline of a family portrait on the wall, a cruel reminder of a happiness that now felt like a dream. A cold draft snaked up from beneath the front door, a chilling whisper that made Helen shiver uncontrollably. The air was thick with the scent of stale dust and decay. In her trembling hand, she clutched the official eviction notice. The paper was coarse and unforgiving, the bold, black ink spelling out their doom. Her stomach twisted into a tight, painful knot. It had been 6 agonizing months since her husband Mark's last breath. 6 months of watching every foundation of their world crumble. The medical debts had been a relentless flood, and now the dam had finally broken. Her heart didn't just ache. It felt like a cold, heavy stone lodged in her chest. From the empty bedroom, a soft, raspy cough echoed, a sound that splintered Helen's already shattered nerves with each repetition. That was Bella, her 8-year-old, huddled under the single thin blanket they had left, her small face pale and listless against the bare mattress on the floor. Beside her, 12-year-old Lucas was methodically placing his few remaining possessions into a worn cardboard box. A tattered baseball glove, a handful of comic books, and a small, framed photo of his father. He worked with a quiet, grim determination that was far too old for his years. His jaw set tight as he refused to meet his mother's anguished eyes. Helen felt a sudden, sickening wave of nausea. She was supposed to be their rock, their protector, and she had failed them completely. The cancer that had stolen her husband had returned to claim their home, their security, their childhood. She could still feel the phantom warmth of Mark's hand in hers, his last whispered promise that she would be strong enough for them all, but she wasn't strong. She was terrified. Helen's hand plunged into the pocket of her thin, frayed coat, her cold fingers brushing against the small, crisp stack of bills. It was all that was left in the entire world. She pulled them out, her hands shaking so violently she could barely hold them steady in the dim light filtering through the grimy window. 5 $100 bills, $500. The sum felt both laughably insignificant and monumentally heavy. This was the last remnant of their savings, the final flimsy barricade against the raw, unforgiving streets of New York City. She could almost smell the sharp, antiseptic scent of the hospital, hear the steady, rhythmic beep of the machines that had kept Mark alive for those last few weeks, each beep an invoice against their future. A sharp pang of hunger shot through her stomach, a gnawing, hollow feeling that had become a constant and unwelcome companion. She smoothed the bills on the cold, dusty windowsill, the paper whispering secrets of a life that no longer existed. It was the price of a few more days, nothing more. A sharp, heavy knock on the door made all 3 of them jump. It wasn't a question, it was a command. "Time is up, Helen." The superintendent's voice was a low growl, gravelly and impatient, completely devoid of any sympathy. Lucas froze, his hands gripping the edges of his cardboard box so tightly, his knuckles turned white. Bella let out a small, frightened whimper from the other room, a sound that felt like a physical blow. Helen felt the last of her composure turn to dust. A sob caught in her throat, hot and painful. She took one last shuddering breath, the air tasting of mildew and utter defeat, and opened the door. The large man barely looked at her, his eyes already scanning the empty space with a detached air of finality. He simply extended a fleshy hand. The key was cold, metallic, and felt impossibly heavy as she dropped it into his waiting palm. He stepped back, pulled the door shut, and the sound of the deadbolt sliding into place was like a gunshot in the silent hallway. They were locked out, alone, abandoned in the dimly lit corridor with 2 small suitcases and the suffocating smell of industrial cleaner. Standing frozen in the sterile hallway, the distant wail of a city siren seemed to amplify her own silent scream. Helen looked down at Lucas, who stared straight ahead, his young face a fragile mask of forced bravery. Her gaze then drifted to the closed door of their former home, imagining Bella huddled inside her blanket, trying to be quiet, trying to be brave too. A tidal wave of despair threatened to pull her under, to drown her right there on the worn linoleum. Her body felt impossibly heavy, her limbs like lead. Every nerve screamed at her to run, to do something, anything, but her feet were rooted to the spot. The city outside was a roaring, indifferent beast, and she was a ghost adrift in its concrete currents with her two small and precious anchors. The weight of their future, of their very next meal, rested squarely on her shoulders, and she had never felt so crushingly, completely weak. Helen's journey of despair is just beginning, and she'll have to face impossible odds to protect her children. If you want to follow her struggle for survival and discover if a mother's love can truly conquer all, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what happens next. The hours following their eviction blurred into a nightmarish crawl. Helen and the children found a hard, cold bench in a small, wind-swept park, the neon city glow offering no warmth, only a cruel, colorful mockery of their desolation. Lucas sat rigidly beside her, his small body a tight coil of anger and fear. Bella had cried herself to sleep against Helen's side, her small, intermittent shivers sending fresh waves of guilt through her mother's exhausted body. Helen felt a terrifying numbness creep over her, a dangerous self-preservation mechanism that threatened to disconnect her from the overwhelming reality. From the bottom of her worn purse, she pulled out a crumpled local newspaper, its pages flimsy and damp from the night air. It was a relic, an act of desperation from a bygone era, but it was all she had. The city roared around them, a symphony of sirens, horns, and distant shouting, and Helen forced herself to focus, her eyes scanning the tiny print as if her life depended on it. Which, she realized with a cold jolt, it did. Her gaze drifted past the bold headlines of world events that felt utterly alien and insignificant. She turned to the classifieds, her finger tracing the columns of text that promised everything from used cars to miracle cures. Tears she refused to let fall blurred the words into a meaningless grey smear. She blinked them back, a raw, burning sensation in her eyes. Her stomach growled, a low, miserable sound she hoped Lucas couldn't hear. What was she even looking for? A room for rent required a deposit. A first month's rent, a credit check, all impossibilities. A job required an address, clean clothes, a mind not consumed by the primal terror of homelessness. Every line of text was a door slamming shut in her face. The paper felt heavy, a ledger of a world she no longer belonged to. A profound sense of hopelessness began to settle in her bones, cold and heavy as lead, and for a terrifying moment, she thought about just giving up, about letting the city swallow them whole. Then her eyes caught it, a small, peculiar ad tucked away in a corner, almost hidden. It didn't offer an apartment, but the perpetual use rights up to an abandoned attic. The words were strange, legalistic, but they didn't matter. What mattered was the location, a historic tenement building on the Lower East Side. It was a place, a physical space. The ad didn't list a price, a detail that allowed a tiny, fragile seed of hope to plant itself in the barren soil of her despair. It felt different from the other listings, less formal, almost like a secret whispered just to her. A faint jolt, like a low-voltage electrical current, ran through her. This could be it. It had to be it. It was a foolish, desperate thought, a straw to grasp in a raging flood, but it was the first flicker of warmth she had felt in days. The decision formed in her mind with a speed that frightened her. This was their only chance. She had to try. She felt her heart begin to beat faster, a frantic, unsteady rhythm of fear and reckless hope. She found a payphone, its grimy receiver cold against her ear, the cord twisted and sticky. She fed it a quarter, her last piece of change, and dialed the number from the ad, her finger trembling. A man's voice answered, gruff and impatient. "Yeah." It was the superintendent. Helen's own voice was a dry whisper as she asked about the attic. She braced herself for an exorbitant figure, a number that would extinguish her tiny spark of hope for good. 500, the man grunted. Cash. Today. Helen felt the world tilt. $500, the exact amount folded in her pocket. The coincidence was so perfect, so absolute, that it felt like both a miracle and a trap. For a dizzying moment, she felt lightheaded, the grimy phone booth seeming to spin around her. It was a sign it had to be. Taking a shaky breath that did little to calm the frantic fluttering in her chest, she agreed. "We'll take it," she heard herself say, the words sealing their fate. The deal was done. All or nothing. The subway ride downtown was a descent into another world. The train screamed and rattled through the dark tunnels, a mechanical beast carrying them deeper into the city's belly. The car was crowded, and the air was thick with the smell of damp wool, stale coffee, and the metallic tang of the rails. Bella, exhausted, slept fitfully in Helen's lap, her small head heavy against her mother's chest. Helen rhythmically stroked her daughter's hair, her own body tense with a knot of growing anxiety. Lucas, however, was wide awake. He sat pressed against the vibrating window, his young face pale and serious, his reflection staring back from the darkened glass like a worried ghost. Helen clutched the straps of their two small suitcases, her knuckles white. The $500, now nestled deep in her coat pocket, felt like a burning coal, a singular point of intense heat and terrifying potential. Every screech of the wheels on the track seemed to be counting down the seconds to their salvation or their ruin. They emerged from the subway station into the Lower East Side. The neighborhood was a stark contrast to the sterile midtown streets they had left behind. The buildings were ancient, titans of dark brick and ornate, crumbling facades, their faces stained with a century of soot and rain. They loomed over the narrow streets, casting long, deep shadows even in the middle of the day. The air here was a chaotic tapestry of smells, the rich aroma of garlic and spices from a dozen different kitchens, the sweet, cloying scent of rotting garbage from overflowing cans, and a low, damp, earthy odor that hinted at the nearby East River. Helen pulled her thin coat tighter around her. The fragile hope she had nurtured in the park began to curdle, replaced by a growing gnawing unease. This was not the charming, historical neighborhood of postcards. This was a place of grit, of survival, of decay. A cold shiver, unrelated to the wind, snaked down her spine. Finding the address from the ad, Helen's stomach sank. The building was a hulking, sagging monolith, even more decrepit and menacing up close than its neighbors. Its dark brick face was a mosaic of neglect, with boarded-up windows staring out like vacant, dead eyes. A rusty fire escape zigzagged down its side, looking more like a skeletal spine than a means of escape. The heavy iron front door was scarred with layers of faded graffiti and grime. Helen felt a lump form in her throat. She found the superintendent's buzzer. The plastic button cracked and yellowed with age. She pressed it, and a harsh, electric crackle split the air, a sound so sudden and jarring it made Bella, now awake, jump with a small, startled cry. For a long moment, there was only silence. Helen's heart pounded against her ribs. She was about to press it again when a loud click echoed from within, and the heavy door slowly creaked open, revealing a chasm of darkness. The superintendent was a stooped, skeletal man with a perpetually sour expression and skin the color of old parchment. A large, jangling ring of keys hung from his belt, clinking like chains with every slight movement. He barely glanced at Helen, his gaze flicking dismissively over the children before settling on her purse. He didn't ask for her name. He just grunted and extended a bony, waiting hand. Helen pulled out the 5 crisp $100 bills. He snatched them from her grasp, the cash disappearing into his pocket without being counted. "This way," he rasped, turning his back on them. He led them down a long, narrow hallway, the air thick and suffocating with the overwhelming stench of old mold and the lingering smell of boiled cabbage. Helen's stomach churned. The dim light from a single, fly-specked bulb cast long, dancing shadows on the peeling, water-stained walls, making the corridor feel like the throat of some great decaying beast. The climb felt endless, a vertical journey into the heart of the building's decay. They ascended flight after flight of creaking wooden stairs, the worn treads groaning in protest under their weight. With each floor, the air grew staler, colder, and heavier, thick with the dust of ages. The only illumination came from single, naked bulbs dangling precariously from frayed, cloth-wrapped wires, casting a weak, yellow-brown glow that did little to pierce the gloom. Helen could hear a symphony of misery, the ragged sound of her own breathing, the soft, shuffling steps of her children behind her, the anxious thumping of her own heart, and a steady, rhythmic drip, 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 echoing from somewhere deep within the building's guts. The sound was like a slow, maddening clock, counting down the moments, each drop a punctuation mark in her litany of regret. She felt a growing tightness in her chest, the air too thick and heavy to draw a proper breath. They finally reached the top-floor landing, a small, cramped space that smelled faintly of ammonia. A rickety wooden ladder was bolted to the wall, leading to a square trapdoor in the ceiling. The superintendent didn't climb. He simply pointed a bony finger upward. "That's it. The attic," he grunted, his voice a gravelly monotone. He pulled a single, rust-pitted key from his jangling ring and slapped it into Helen's palm. The metal was cold and sharp against her skin. Without another word, without a backward glance, he turned and began his shuffling descent, his form quickly swallowed by the shadows below. The sound of his footsteps faded, leaving Helen, Lucas, and Bella in a sudden, profound silence. The finality of his departure was a physical blow. She clutched the key, the last $500 of her life, condensed into this single rusty piece of metal. Alone at the top of the world, she was overcome with a terrifying sense of isolation. A wave of dread washed over Helen as she stared up at the trapdoor. It was their last hope, the final destination of their desperate gamble. "Lucas, help me," she whispered, her voice hoarse. Together they positioned themselves under the trapdoor. With a shared grunt of effort, they pushed upwards. The wooden door was heavy, swollen with damp, and it resisted, scraping against its frame with a horrible groan. As it finally gave way, a gust of foul air rushed down, a physical assault on their senses. It was a thick, complex stench, an unholy trinity of old, rotting wood, the musty odor of pervasive mold, and the sharp, acrid reek of years, perhaps decades, of accumulated pigeon droppings. Helen instinctively recoiled, a hand flying to her mouth as she fought back a wave of nausea. Lucas coughed, turning his head away, his face contorted in disgust. Bella buried her face in Helen's coat, whimpering. This was not the smell of a home. This was the smell of a tomb. Taking a shallow, foul-tasting breath, Helen pulled herself up and through the opening, her heart hammering against her ribs. Her foot landed not on a solid floor, but on something soft and dry that crunched under her weight. She looked down. The entire floor was a disgusting carpet of filth, a mixture of dirt, crumbling plaster, desiccated pigeon carcasses, and a thick layer of droppings. The air was so heavy and stagnant it felt wet, clinging to her skin and clothes. She felt a wave of soul-crushing disappointment so intense it almost buckled her knees. This was not a space to live. It was a hazard. Dark, greasy stains, like angry bruises, marred the slanted walls and the low, wooden-beamed ceiling, mapping out the paths of countless leaks. Lucas and Bella climbed up behind her, their small faces a mask of horror as they took in the scene. The silence in the attic was absolute, broken only by Bella's soft, terrified sobs. The hope that had carried them here died in that moment. Her eyes, slowly adjusting to the gloom, began to pick out the details of the ruin, each one a fresh stab of despair. The small, soot-covered glass pane mentioned in her imagination was a tiny, grime-caked skylight, so thick with filth that it allowed only a murky, grey twilight to filter through, casting the entire space in a depressing, underwater gloom. In one dark corner, a terrifying tangle of ancient, cloth-insulated electrical wires hung exposed from the ceiling like a nest of dead black snakes. Helen felt a prickle of fear on her skin. It was an obvious fire hazard, a death trap waiting to be sprung. As she stood frozen, a new sound reached her ears, a faint scratching and skittering from within the walls. Rats, or worse. The sound was insidious, the secret life of the building's decay, and it made her skin crawl. This wasn't just a dirty room. It was an actively unhealthy, dangerous space, unfit for any living thing. Tucked away under the lowest part of the slanted roof, so low an adult couldn't stand upright, was a small, doorless cubicle. This, she realized with a sickening lurch in her stomach, was the bathroom. Inside sat a toilet, its porcelain bowl stained a nauseating yellow-brown and featuring a long spiderweb crack down its side. A single, heavily rusted pipe emerged from the wall above it, a bead of brown water clinging to its end before slowly dripping onto the filthy floor. The stench emanating from this corner was even more potent than the rest of the attic, a vile combination of old sewage and active rot that burned the back of her throat. The nausea she had been fighting for hours finally won. She doubled over, her body convulsing as she vomited the little that was in her stomach onto the filthy floor, the acidic taste of bile mixing with the foul air. This was the bottom, This was worse than the street. Helen straightened up, wiping her mouth with the back of her trembling hand. She stood in the center of the squalid, suffocating space, the sounds of the city Mercato below a distant, mocking echo. She looked at her children. Lucas was standing perfectly still, his fists clenched at his sides, his young face a battlefield of shock, disgust, and a dawning, terrible understanding. Bella, her small face streaked with tears and dirt, had resumed her quiet, heartbreaking whimpering, a sound that seemed to be absorbed by the oppressive, dead air. This wasn't a home. This wasn't even a shelter. It was a cage of disease and danger, a forgotten space at the top of a dying building. She had spent their very last dollar, their final hope, to trap her children in this hell. The fragile, desperate hope that had propelled her here shattered into a million razor-sharp pieces, and she felt a coldness spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the attic's chill. It was the absolute icy certainty of having hit rock bottom. For 2 days, a grim and silent routine took hold. The despair was a physical presence, a cold fog that clung to them in the foul-smelling attic, but Helen refused to let it paralyze her. Action, any action, was the only antidote. She and Lucas worked tirelessly, a silent, determined team fueled by a primal need to impose some semblance of order on the chaos. They used pieces of cardboard as makeshift dustpans, gathering piles of filth and debris. Every scoop was an act of defiance. Helen felt the muscles in her back and arms burn with a dull, constant ache, but she welcomed the pain. It was a distraction from the gnawing hunger in her belly and the sharp, piercing terror in her heart. She could not fix their homelessness. She could not conjure food or money, but she could fight the dirt. This tiny, squalid space was their whole world now, and she would not surrender it to decay without a fight. Her hands, raw and chapped, became weapons against the filth. The children were her compass. Bella, initially terrified, had created a small nest for herself with their one blanket in the cleanest corner they had managed to clear. Her small collection of toys arranged in a protective circle. She barely spoke, her large eyes following Helen's every move. Lucas, on the other hand, worked with a grim intensity that mirrored his mother's. He was her shadow, her partner in this miserable labor, his boyish energy replaced by a quiet, focused resolve. He never complained. He just worked. Helen's heart twisted with a painful mixture of pride and sorrow every time she looked at him. He was being forced to shed his childhood far too soon, carrying burdens no 12-year-old should ever have to bear. A wave of guilt, sharp and familiar, washed over her. She had brought them here. This was her failure. The thought was a constant, agonizing hum beneath the surface of her frantic activity, a wound that refused to close. On the 3rd day, Helen's gaze fell upon a heavy, old wooden chest tucked into the darkest corner, beneath the lowest part of the slanted roof. It was a massive, dark object, bound with rusted iron straps, its surface coated in a thick, greasy layer of grime. It took up valuable space, a dead weight in their already cramped existence. She decided it had to be moved. She wanted to clear that corner to make a designated sleeping area, a small zone of relative order. It seemed like a simple, practical task, a continuation of their war on filth. "Lucas, come give me a hand," she called, her voice echoing strangely in the dusty air. The chest looked ancient, immovable, a relic from a time long before they were born. As she approached it, she noticed the air around it was colder, the smell of damp rot more pronounced. A strange, inexplicable reluctance made her hesitate for a second, a flicker of unease she couldn't name. Together, they positioned themselves, one on each side. "On 3, Helen grunted, planting her feet firmly on the disgusting floor. 1, 2, 3. They pushed with all their might. Helen's muscles screamed in protest. Lucas let out a strained groan, his face red with effort. The chest didn't budge. It was as if it were rooted to the very structure of the building. They tried again, this time trying to rock it. The iron straps felt cold and unforgiving under Helen's palms. The wood was dense, heavy, saturated with decades of damp. As they put their full weight into a 3rd, desperate shove, a sound cut through the silence. It wasn't the scraping of wood on wood. It was a different sound, a deep, hollow creak, followed by a soft, splintering noise that seemed to come from directly beneath the chest. It was a sound of something giving way, a sound that did not belong. They both froze, their breath held tight in their chests. The sound had been subtle, but distinct, and it had come from the floor. Lucas looked at his mother, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and curiosity. "What was that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Helen felt her heart begin to beat a little faster. An unfamiliar sensation, a prickle of something other than despair, stirred within her. She knelt down, her knees protesting as they pressed into the grimy floorboards. She tried to peer under the heavy chest, but the space was too dark, the angle impossible. "Joyce, we have to move it," she said, her voice now charged with a new, strange energy. It was no longer about cleaning. Something had changed. That single, unexpected sound had shifted the very atmosphere of the attic, transforming it from a mere ruin into a place that held a secret. A loop of a new question had just been opened in her mind. Ignoring their aching muscles, they attacked the chest with renewed vigor, this time driven by a frantic curiosity. They wedged their feet against the wall and pushed with every ounce of strength they possessed. The chest groaned, scraped, and then, with a final, shuddering jolt, it slid sideways just a few inches. It was enough. Helen immediately dropped to her knees again, her eyes fixed on the spot where the chest had been. The floorboards were dark with age and filth, but one of them looked different. Where the leg of the chest had been, the wood was slightly depressed. A long, dark crack, thin as a hair, was now visible along its edge. She pressed down on it with her finger. The board moved. It sank a fraction of an inch with a faint, hollow echo. Her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't just a loose board. This was intentional. This was hidden. "Get me the knife," Helen whispered, her eyes never leaving the floorboard. "The kitchen knife." Lucas, sensing the gravity in his mother's tone, scrambled to their small pile of belongings and returned with the cheap paring knife they used for everything. Her hand was trembling slightly as she took it from him. She felt a bizarre mix of emotions, the cold dread of the unknown mixed with a wild, irrational flicker of hope. What if this was something? Anything? She carefully inserted the tip of the blade into the dark crack. The wood was soft and splintered easily. She began to pry, working the blade back and forth. The wood groaned in protest. Dust and grime rained down as the seal of ages was broken. The sound of the metal scraping against the wood was loud in the suffocating silence of the attic. Her heart was pounding a frantic, heavy rhythm against her ribs. With a final sharp crack, the board splintered and popped loose. Helen pulled it up and away. It wasn't just a floorboard. It was the lid of a small, cleverly concealed trapdoor, its underside reinforced with thin metal strips. Her eyes widened. A square of perfect as consuming darkness was revealed in the floor. A wave of cold, musty air wafted up from the opening, a smell completely different from the attic's foul stench. This was the dry, clean scent of old, undisturbed things. The smell of time itself. It was the scent of a secret kept for a very, very long time. Lucas leaned in closer, his face a mask of awe. "A secret door," he breathed, the words full of childish wonder that stood in stark contrast to their grim reality. Helen felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold. What could possibly be hidden in the floor of a place like this, and why? She reached into the dark opening, her fingers brushing against something soft and slightly fuzzy. It felt like old fabric. She pulled. It was a lining of some kind, a layer of frayed dark green felt that covered the bottom of the cavity. It was a false bottom, a secret compartment built into the space between the attic floor and the ceiling of the apartment below. Her hand, trembling with a mixture of fear and anticipation, moved deeper into the space, exploring the darkness. Her fingers brushed against something else, something heavy, something made of cloth, but lumpy and solid within. A bag. She gripped it. The material was soft, worn velvet, pulled tight by a drawstring. It was heavier than it should be, impossibly so. Her pulse throbbed in her ears. The weight of it, the dense, promising weight, sent a jolt of electricity up her arm. With her heart lodged in her throat, Helen pulled the first bag out into the murky grey light of the attic. It was made of deep burgundy velvet, now faded and dusty, and it was tied shut with a frayed silk cord. Her fingers fumbled with the knot, the simple task made impossible by their shaking, giving up. She pulled at the top of the bag, forcing it open. What slid out into her palm was not treasure from a storybook. There was no dazzling sparkle, no fantasy gleam. It was something far more real and far more shocking. A small, heavy bar of metal, about the size of her thumb. It had a dull, soft-looking sheen in the dim light, and it was stamped with a series of tiny numbers and a small insignia. It was unmistakably, unbelievably, gold. She stared at it, her mind refusing to process what her eyes were seeing. It was a dream. It had to be. Her breath came in short, sharp gasps. She tipped the bag, and a cascade of identical small bars tumbled out onto the dusty floor, landing with a series of soft, heavy thuds. The sound was magical, surreal. It was the sound of weight, of substance, of a reality so far removed from her own it felt like a hallucination. 10, 20, 30 small gold bars, a king's ransom lying in the filth of their squalid prison. She reached out a trembling finger and touched one. It was cool and smooth and incredibly dense. It was real. A single, hysterical laugh bubbled up in her throat, a sound halfway between a sob and a scream. Lucas just stared, his mouth agape, his young mind unable to comprehend the sheer magnitude of what lay before them. Gold, real gold, in their attic. It was impossible. It was a miracle. It was, she suddenly realized with a fresh stab of fear, incredibly dangerous. Her hand dove back into the secret compartment, her earlier hesitation replaced by a frantic urgency. There was more. Her fingers found another bag, this one smaller and made of black velvet. It had a different feel, not the solid weight of the gold, but a lumpy, irregular shape. She pulled it out. This one was lighter. She loosened the drawstring and carefully poured the contents into her other hand. A small pile of dull, greasy-looking stones clattered into her palm. They weren't polished or cut. They were rough, milky and irregular, uncut diamonds. They didn't sparkle, but they seemed to drink the meager light, holding a deep, internal luminescence. Helen stared at the raw, priceless stones, feeling a wave of dizziness wash over her. The gold was incomprehensible, but this felt like something from another world. A secret torn from the very heart of the earth and hidden here, in this forgotten place. There was something else in the compartment. It wasn't in a bag. It was wedged into the corner, and her searching fingers brushed against the smooth, cool texture of worn leather. She carefully worked it free and pulled it out. It was a book, a diary. It was bound in dark, cracked leather, its cover bare of any title. It was heavy in her hands, thick with pages, and held shut by a simple leather strap. The air around it smelled of old paper and fading ink, a scent that was both scholarly and deeply personal. This, she felt with a sudden, bone-deep certainty, was more important than the gold or the diamonds. The fortune was a what. This diary was the why. It held the story. It held the truth. A shiver ran down her spine. Opening this book would be like opening a door to the past, and she had no idea what ghosts might be waiting on the other side. Tucked behind the diary was one last item, a thick bundle of papers, folded and tied with a faded piece of string. They were brittle and yellowed with age, the edges crumbling slightly as she handled them. She could see dense blocks of text written in a spidery, unfamiliar script. A chill went through her as she recognized some of the words. It was German. Formal, official-looking documents, covered in stamps and severe-looking letterhead. On top of the bundle, held in place by the string, was a small, dark blue booklet, an old American passport. She gently slid it free. The photograph inside was faded, a black-and-white image of a man in his 40s with kind, dark eyes, a neat mustache, and a ghost of a worried smile. Her eyes scanned the typed information. Name, Samuel Glickman. The name felt heavy, important. This was him. This was the man who had hidden a fortune in her floor. Helen sat back on her heels, the full weight of her discovery crashing down on her. Before her, spread out on the filthy floorboards, was a life, a fortune in gold and diamonds, and the story of the man who had owned them. Samuel Glickman. The name echoed in her mind. Who was he? Why was his fortune hidden here? Why did he have official papers in German? 1,000 questions swirled in her head, each one more urgent and more frightening than the last. This wasn't just found money. This was a legacy, a secret, and now it was her secret. The initial shock and elation began to curdle into a profound and terrifying sense of responsibility. She looked at the gold, then at the diary, then at the face of the man in the passport. This wasn't the end of their problems. She had a chilling certainty that this was the beginning of a whole new kind of danger. She quickly, almost frantically, began to gather everything. Her hands shook as she swept the gold bars back into the velvet bag, the soft clinking of the metal sounding deafeningly loud in the quiet attic. The very existence of this treasure felt like a shout in a library, a dangerous anomaly that could bring ruin upon them if discovered. She felt a primal instinct to hide it, to put it back where it came from, to pretend they had never found it, but she couldn't. It was too late. The secret was out, and it was sitting in her lap. The knowledge of it changed everything. She could no longer see the attic as just a squalid shelter. It was now a vault, a tomb, a place haunted by the ghost of Samuel Glickman and his hidden fortune. The air, already thick with mold, now seemed charged with the weight of his story, waiting to be told. Lucas sat silently beside her, his earlier awe replaced by a wide-eyed fear that mirrored her own. "Mom," he whispered, his voice trembling, "what are we going to do?" Helen looked at her son, then at the sleeping form of her daughter in the corner, blissfully unaware of the impossible secret that now lived with them in the attic. She had no answer. For the first time in days, the gnawing hunger in her stomach was gone, replaced by a cold, tight knot of fear. This fortune could be their salvation. It could buy them a home, food, a future, or it could be a curse. It could be the reason someone had made Samuel Glickman disappear, and whoever that was, they might still be looking for his treasure. The thought sent a jolt of pure ice through her veins. They were not alone in this story. They had just stumbled into the middle of it. She took the leather diary in her hands. The cover felt soft and worn, molded by the hands of the man who had written in it. Slowly, she untied the strap and opened it to the first page. The handwriting was elegant but hurried, the English occasionally interspersed with German words. The ink was faded to a sepia brown. The first entry was dated October 1942. The words seemed to lift off the page, not just as text, but as a voice, a desperate whisper from the past. Helen began to read, her lips moving silently, her mind falling down a rabbit hole of history. She was no longer just a desperate mother in a filthy attic. She was becoming the keeper of a secret, the guardian of a ghost's last will and testament. The shift was absolute. The struggle for survival had ended, and a new, far more dangerous game of mystery and memory had just begun. She carefully placed the gold hoard, the diamonds, and the passport back into the secret compartment. They were safer there, hidden from sight. But she kept the diary. She couldn't put it away. It felt warm in her hands, a living thing. She hid it under the single thin mattress where she and Bella slept, a fragile secret tucked away in their meager bedding. The weight of it was immense. She felt like an unwilling conspirator in a crime she didn't understand, a recipient of a treasure she hadn't earned. The joy of the discovery had completely evaporated, leaving behind only the cold, heavy residue of fear and uncertainty. Every creak of the old building, every scuttling sound in the walls, now sounded like a threat. Was someone watching? Did someone know? The paranoia was immediate and suffocating. Night fell, but sleep offered no escape. Helen lay awake in the darkness, the sounds of her children's soft breathing the only comfort in the oppressive silence. The murky light from the grimy skylight cast strange, dancing shadows on the ceiling. She kept thinking about the look in Samuel Glickman's eyes in the passport photo. It was the look of a man who knew fear, a man who was running from something. He had fled one nightmare in Europe, only to find another one here, in the supposed safety of New York City. She felt a strange kinship with him, a connection across the decades. He had been trying to protect his family, to save them, and now, in a bizarre twist of fate, his last desperate act of preservation had fallen into her hands. The responsibility of it felt like a physical weight on her chest, making it hard to breathe. What was she supposed to do? The questions circled her mind like vultures. Go to the police. Tell them she, a homeless woman who had illegally purchased the rights to an attic, had found a fortune in gold and diamonds. They would never believe her. They would take it all, and she and her children would be back on the street. But this time with a dangerous story attached to their names. Keep it. Try to sell it. How? A woman like her, walking into a shop with uncut diamonds or a bar of gold, would be arrested in minutes. The treasure was a cage. It was a fortune she couldn't touch, a salvation she couldn't use. The irony was so cruel it was almost laughable. She was sitting on a treasure that could solve all her problems, yet she had never felt more trapped, more powerless. The diary was the key. She knew it. The truth, and therefore the path forward, had to be in those pages. She had only glanced at the first entry, but the story it promised was the only thing that could unravel this knot. Tomorrow, she decided, as the first faint hints of dawn began to lighten the filthy skylight. Tomorrow she would read. She would learn Samuel Glickman's story. She would find out what happened to him, why he hid his life's savings, and who he was afraid of. The fear was still there, a cold stone in her gut, but now it was mixed with something else. A fierce, burning resolve. She owed it to him. She owed it to the man with the worried eyes, whose secret was now her own. And more importantly, she owed it to her children to find a way out of this, and the dead man's words were her only map. The next morning, as the children explored the far corners of the attic, creating a game out of the grim surroundings, Helen pulled out the diary. She sat with her back against the rough plaster wall, the book open in her lap. The paper was brittle, and she turned each page with extreme care, as if the story itself might crumble to dust in her hands. The English was clear, if accented. Samuel wrote of his life in Berlin as a celebrated jeweler, of the rising tide of hatred, the nights of broken glass, and the terrifying, systematic erasure of his world. He wrote of the frantic, desperate plan to escape, of converting his family's wealth into the most portable, universal forms, gold and diamonds. The words were not just a record, they were a cry of pain, a testament to loss. Helen felt her own struggles pale in comparison. She read about the perilous journey, the false documents, the bribes paid to indifferent officials, the constant, heart-stopping fear of being caught and sent back. He wrote of arriving in New York Harbor, seeing the Statue of Liberty not as a symbol of hope, but as a silent, intimidating giant. He and his family, his wife, Rachel, and his young son, David, had survived. They had made it. They had the fortune hidden in their luggage. They were alive. Helen felt a lump form in her throat. She looked over at Lucas and Bella. She understood the primal terror of a parent trying to shield their children from a world that had turned hostile. She felt a powerful connection to this man she had never met, a shared understanding that transcended time and circumstance. But the tone of the diary began to change. The relief of arrival slowly gave way to a new kind of anxiety. Samuel described his new life, opening a small jewelry workshop with an American partner, a man he had met who had helped him navigate the city. He wrote of the apartment he had rented, the one directly below this very attic. He wrote of his son David making friends with a boy in the building, a boy named Elias. The name jumped out at Helen, though she didn't know why. The diary entries became shorter, more hurried. A new fear was creeping into the pages, a fear not of a foreign regime, but of something closer, more insidious, the sense of being watched. The whispers in a language he didn't fully understand. The war was raging in Europe, and here in New York suspicion of foreigners, especially Germans, was high. His relief was souring into paranoia. The diary's final pages crackled under Helen's trembling fingers, the paper so brittle it felt like dried leaves. The entries, dated early 1943, were no longer reflective. They were a frantic chronicle of escalating terror. The elegant script had devolved into a jagged, hurried scrawl, the ink sometimes blotting as if the pen had been pressed with desperate force. Helen felt a cold dread begin to pool in her stomach, a sickening echo of Samuel Glickman's own fear seeping through the decades. He wrote of his partner, a man named Alistair Finch, a name that felt like a splinter of ice in Helen's mind. The questions had started, casual at first, then more pointed. Questions about his life in Germany, about his assets, about how he had managed to escape with so much when so many had lost everything. The trust that had been the foundation of their partnership was rotting from the inside out. The words seemed to lift from the page, a ghostly whisper in the silent attic. January 12th. Alistair spoke to me of patriotism today, of duty. He says there are spies everywhere, enemies hidden among us, and that true Americans must be vigilant. When he said it, he looked right at me. And his eyes, Gott in Himmel, His eyes were not the eyes of my friend. They were cold, like a winter river. I see now the face of a wolf behind the sheep's mask. Helen had to stop reading, her breath catching in her throat. The name, Finch, repeated in her mind. It felt too real, too close. She looked over at the bundle of German documents, their official stamps and severe script suddenly making horrifying sense. They weren't just papers, they were Samuel's proof, his desperate, useless defense against the lie that was about to consume him. She forced herself to read on, her heart hammering against her ribs. The next entry was a short, brutal paragraph, written with such haste that the letters bled into one another. February 3rd. He knows I don't know how, but he knows about the gold. He accused me to my face this afternoon in the shop, called me a spy for the Reich, me, a Jew who fled their fire. I tried to show him the papers proving the funds were legal, my family's history. He laughed. He said documents can be forged. He said he would do his duty as an American. He is not coming for me. He is coming for what I have. The raw injustice of it made Helen feel sick. The same bitter nausea she had felt when she first saw the attic's filth rose in her throat. It was the taste of absolute betrayal. The final entry was just a few lines, smeared and almost illegible, crammed at the bottom of a page. February 5th at night. They are at the door, heavy footsteps on the stairs. It is him. I hear his voice. I have hidden it all, in the one place he would never look, under the floor of the forgotten space above. Rachel and David are crying. I have told them to be quiet. May God forgive Alistair for what he has done. May God protect my family. After that, nothing. Page after page of empty, yellowed paper. The silence of those blank pages was a scream that echoed across 80 years. Helen slammed the diary shut, a sob escaping her lips. They had just vanished, erased. A wife and a child, a whole family, sacrificed on the altar of greed. Her own heart ached with a profound, vicarious grief for the ghosts of the Glickman family. The monstrous truth settled over her, cold and sharp as glass. Alistair Finch had used the hysteria of the war as his weapon. He had painted his Jewish partner, a man fleeing the Nazi Holocaust, as a German spy. The ultimate cruel irony. He had summoned the power of the federal government to eliminate his business partner, to make him disappear so he could seize everything. The jewelry shop, the inventory, the apartment just below her feet. But he had failed. In his last moments of freedom, Samuel had outsmarted him, hiding the heart of his fortune, the true prize. The golden diamonds weren't just treasure. They were the proof of a life and the evidence of an unimaginable crime. The weight of this knowledge was suffocating, pinning Helen to the filthy attic floor. A sudden, sharp knock from below shattered the silence. It wasn't a knock on a door, but a hard, solid rap against the wooden trapdoor to the attic itself. The sound was so unexpected, so violent in the dead quiet, that Helen cried out, the diary tumbling from her lap. Her heart instantly felt as if it had been seized by a cold hand, the frantic beat echoing in her ears. Lucas and Bella, who had been playing a quiet game with pebbles in a corner, scrambled to her side, their small faces masks of alarm. The knock came again, louder this time, a percussive, impatient sound that vibrated through the floorboards. It was not a request. It was a command. A shiver of pure dread, cold and electric, shot down Helen's spine. The ghost story she had just read was knocking at her door. Then a voice called up from the landing, and the sound of it chilled her to the bone. It was a man's voice, smooth, educated, but laced with an undeniable thread of arrogance. "Hello? Is anyone up there?" The superintendent mentioned the space was occupied. "My name is Arthur Finch. I own several units in this building. I'd like a word." The name, Finch. It hit Helen with the force of a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. It couldn't be a coincidence. The wolf from the diary. He had a grandson. A cold sweat, clammy and horrible, broke out across her skin. Her mind spun, desperately connecting the treacherous Alistair from the diary to this man, this voice from below. He was here. After all these years, a Finch had returned. Her body was paralyzed, every muscle screaming at her to remain hidden, to stay silent, to will them all into invisibility. But it was too late. He knew she was here. The superintendent had told him. She was trapped. Lucas tugged on her sleeve, his eyes wide with a question she couldn't possibly answer. What do we do? There was no escape. She had to face him. She had to face the ghost of Alistair Finch. Taking a deep, shuddering breath that did nothing to calm the wild fluttering in her chest, Helen crawled towards the trapdoor. The wood felt cold beneath her palms. Who is it?" she called down. Her voice came out as a pathetic, trembling whisper, a sound of pure fear that she barely recognized as her own. She felt like a cornered animal. "Arthur Finch," the voice repeated, a little louder this time, a hint of impatience coloring the smooth vowels. "As I said, I have an interest in this building. A long family history here. I'm looking to consolidate my holdings and I'd like to acquire the rights to this particular space. Please, open up. We can discuss it." The words family history were a poisoned dart. He was baiting her, testing her. This wasn't a real estate transaction, it was a hunt. He was searching for his grandfather's lost prize. A sudden, surprising surge of adrenaline cut through her terror, sharpening her senses. She thought of Samuel's final, desperate words. She thought of her own children cowering behind her, with hands that shook uncontrollably. She pushed the heavy trapdoor open and peered down into the gloom. The man standing on the landing below was the very picture of wealth and power. He was tall, lean, and dressed in a dark, impeccably tailored suit that seemed to radiate its own quiet authority, a stark and jarring contrast to the squalor of the decaying building. His dark hair was threaded with distinguished silver at the temples, and his features were sharp and handsome, like a figure carved from cold marble. But it was his eyes that ensnared Helen's gaze. They were a pale, arctic blue, piercingly intelligent and utterly devoid of warmth. They swept over the filthy attic, over her children, and finally settled on her. His gaze a clinical, predatory assessment that made her skin crawl. His very presence seemed to suck the air from the stairwell, leaving only a suffocating vacuum of menace. He made no move to climb the ladder, instead looking up at her from his position of casual command. A faint, condescending smile touched his lips, a smile that did not reach his cold eyes. "So, you're the new tenant. I have to say, the old place is in even worse shape than I remembered." He paused, letting the calculated insult hang in the stagnant air. "My grandfather," he continued, his voice dropping slightly, "used to tell me stories about this attic. He always believed it was haunted." Helen's heart hammered against her ribs, each beat a painful thud. He knows, or he suspects. The mention of his grandfather was not a casual remark. It was a deliberate move in a cruel game, a way of letting her know exactly who he was and what he was looking for. "Look," he said, his voice shifting abruptly to a tone of feigned, magnanimous reason, "this space is clearly uninhabitable. It's a danger to you and your children. Frankly, I would be doing you a favor." He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and produced a slim, elegant leather checkbook and a gold pen that glinted in the dim light. "I'm prepared to offer you $2,000, cash, for the perpetual use rights you so unwisely purchased. It's a considerable profit on your initial investment. You can take your children and find a real home." The offer was a calculated insult, a ridiculously small sum designed to show her how little he thought of her, to establish his dominance. This wasn't a negotiation. It was an ultimatum. Helen stared down at him, her mind a maelstrom of terror and a hot, unfamiliar surge of righteous fury. The ghost of Samuel Glickman felt intensely present, a silent witness to this confrontation. This man, this arrogant creature of inherited privilege, was the grandson of a thief and a traitor, and he now stood on the very spot where his grandfather's crime had been set in motion. He wanted to buy back the scene of the crime for pocket change, to finally claim his family's stolen prize and erase the last trace of the Glickmans from history, the memory of the diary, of Rachel and David's tears, of a family's stolen future, solidified something hard and unbending in Helen's soul. "No," she said. The word was quiet, but it rang with a defiant clarity in the tense air. "It's not for sale." Arthur Finch's patronizing smile dissolved instantly. The thin veneer of civility evaporated, and for one terrifying second, Helen saw the cold, predatory wolf from Samuel's diary staring back at her. His pale blue eyes narrowed to icy slits, and the atmosphere in the stairwell grew heavy and cold. He slowly, deliberately, slid the gold pen back into his pocket and closed the checkbook with a soft, final snap. The sound was like a judge's gavel. "That is a mistake." he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous murmur that seemed to crawl up the ladder and coil around her throat. A very foolish, very predictable mistake. You should reconsider your position carefully. He took a single, deliberate step back from the base of the ladder, his gaze flicking upwards, past her, to the terrifying tangle of old, frayed electrical wires hanging exposed from the ceiling near the trapdoor opening. The gesture was unmistakable. Old buildings like this, they're so unpredictable, he said, his voice now a soft, venomous purr. The threat, though veiled, was as clear as a blade held to her throat. Accidents are always happening. Faulty wiring. It can cause a terrible fire. It would be an unspeakable tragedy if something were to happen to you and your lovely children up here in the dark. He held her terrified gaze for one more chilling moment, then turned without another word and descended the stairs. His expensive shoes made sharp, echoing clicks on the wooden steps, each sound a nail being hammered into a coffin. Helen was left trembling, the poison of his words hanging in the foul, silent air. What would you do if you were her? Would you take the money and run for your children's lives, leaving the secret and its fortune to a monster? Or would you stay and fight for a justice that has been denied for decades, risking the only thing you have left in the world? The click of Arthur Finch's shoes faded into the building's groaning symphony, but his presence remained, a toxic residue in the air. Helen scrambled back from the trapdoor as if its edge were white-hot, her body trembling violently. The threat, so calmly delivered, echoed in her mind, replaying in an endless, sickening loop. Faulty wiring. A terrible fire. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a promise. He had seen the exposed wires, had catalogued the attic's vulnerabilities with the cool, appraising eye of a predator. She stared at the terrifying tangle of black cables hanging near the opening, and for the first time, their danger felt personal, aimed directly at her and her children. The very walls of the attic, their only sanctuary, now felt like the jaws of a trap slowly closing around them. A wave of ice-cold dread washed over her, so profound it made her gasp for breath, her lungs feeling tight and constricted. She was no longer just a person who had found something. She was a target. She scurried back to the corner where Lucas and Bella huddled, their faces pale and their eyes wide with a fear that mirrored her own. She wrapped her arms around them, pulling them into a fierce, protective embrace. Their small, trembling bodies were a stark, agonizing reminder of what was at stake. It wasn't about the gold anymore. It wasn't even about justice for Samuel Glickman. It was about survival. Finch's threat had stripped away all illusion, leaving only the brutal, primal reality of their situation. He would not stop. He believed the fortune was his by right of blood and theft, and he would burn them alive to get it. A sob, hot and ragged, tore from her throat. She buried her face in Bella's hair, the familiar scent of her daughter, a fragile anchor in a swirling vortex of terror. Her mind raced, a frantic, desperate scramble for a plan, an escape, but every thought led to a dead end. They were trapped at the top of a decaying building, with a monster circling below. The hours that followed were a waking nightmare. Every creak of the ancient building, every gust of wind that rattled the filthy skylight, sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through her. She felt hunted, every nerve stretched taut, listening for the sound of his return. She took the diary and the bundle of German documents from their hiding place, wrapping them in their spare blanket and holding the bundle close, as if it were a shield. She couldn't leave it, but possessing it felt like holding a live grenade. The weight of the secret, once a source of wonder, was now an unbearable physical burden. She looked at Lucas, who sat staring at the trapdoor, his young face set in a grim, watchful expression. He had heard the threat too. He understood the danger. The innocence had been burned out of his eyes, replaced by the weary vigilance of a soldier. Helen felt a fresh wave of self-loathing. She had led her children into a war they couldn't possibly win, a war against a ghost with a very real and very dangerous grandson. As dusk began to bleed its grey light through the grimy skylight, a new sound came. A soft, hesitant tapping at the trapdoor. It was so different from Finch's hard, arrogant rap that for a moment Helen thought she had imagined it. Tap, tap, tap. It was gentle, questioning. Her heart leaped into her throat anyway, the fear so ingrained now that any sound was a threat. Lucas grabbed her arm, his eyes wide. "Mom," he whispered, his voice shaking. Helen put a finger to her lips, her body frozen. The tapping came again, accompanied by a voice, thin and reedy, like the rustling of dry leaves. "Hello? Excuse me? The woman with the children?" It was the voice of a very old man, laced with a fragile courtesy that seemed to belong to another century entirely. "I saw that vulture, Mr. Finch, leave your stairwell. I thought perhaps you could use a cup of warm tea, it is getting cold." The offer was so simple, so kind, that it was utterly disarming. Suspicion warred with a desperate need for any human connection. The voice from below was patient, not demanding. It held no menace, only a quiet concern that felt alien in the hostile environment of the building. Helen crawled slowly toward the opening, her body still coiled with tension. She peered down. Standing on the landing was a man who seemed as ancient as the building itself. He was stooped and impossibly frail, his skin like wrinkled parchment stretched thin over delicate bones. He wore a neatly patched cardigan over a faded shirt, and his eyes, though clouded with age, were clear and kind. He held up a hand in a gesture of peace. "I am Elias. I live on the second floor. For 92 years, I have lived here. I mean you no harm." I saw the look on that man's face. I know the look of a Finch. The name, spoken with such weary familiarity, sent a shiver down Helen's spine. This old man knew them. He knew the name. The last threads of her resistance snapped. She had no allies, no options. A cup of tea felt like a lifeline. With a deep, shuddering breath, Helen nodded. "One moment," she whispered, her voice hoarse. She helped a wary Lucas and a frightened Bella down the rickety ladder first, then descended herself, her knees weak and trembling. As her feet touched the landing, Mr. Elias gave her a small, sad smile. "Come," he said softly, turning to lead the way. "It is not safe for you up there now." The journey down 2 flights of stairs felt like traveling through time. The air on the second-floor landing was different, less stagnant, and carried a faint, pleasant scent of chamomile and old wool. The door to Mr. Elias's apartment was painted a cheerful, if peeling blue. It was a small island of care in an ocean of neglect. When he opened the door and ushered them inside, Helen felt as if she had stepped into another world entirely, a world preserved under glass, safe from the decay that consumed the rest of the building. The contrast with the attic was so stark it was dizzying. Mr. Elias's small apartment was a sanctuary of order and memory. The air was warm and smelled wonderful, a complex aroma of brewing tea, cedar from an old wardrobe, and the faint, dusty sweetness of dried flowers. Every surface was immaculately clean, covered with neatly crocheted doilies. The furniture was old, but lovingly polished, its dark wood gleaming softly in the warm lamplight. On a small table, a pot of tea was already steeping, steam curling gracefully from its spout. Framed, sepia-toned photographs covered the walls, a gallery of smiling ghosts from a bygone era. Helen's eyes drank in the scene, the sheer normality and peace of it making her want to weep. It was a home, a real home, filled with the quiet dignity of a life lived with care, and its warmth was a balm to her raw, afraid nerves. He settled them at a small round table, pouring the fragrant, steaming tea into delicate, mismatched china cups. His hands, gnarled with arthritis and crisscrossed with a roadmap of blue veins, were steady as he served the children first, placing a small sugar cookie beside each of their cups. Bella, who had been clinging to Helen's leg, slowly relaxed, her gaze fixed on the old man's kind face. Lucas, however, remained watchful, his teacup untouched, his body still tense with suspicion. Mr. Elias took a seat opposite Helen, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't speak for a long moment, simply observing them with his watery, pale eyes, a profound sadness in his gaze. He looked at Lucas, and a flicker of something, a deep, ancient memory, passed across his face. "You have his eyes," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper, "just like David, the same serious eyes." Helen's heart skipped a beat. David, the name from the diary, Samuel Glickman's son. She stared at Mr. Elias, her mind reeling. The boy David had made friends with, the boy in the building. It was him. You knew them?" Helen asked, her voice trembling as she finally voiced the question. Mr. Elias nodded slowly, his gaze drifting to a faded photograph on the wall. It showed two young boys in knickerbockers, their arms around each other, grinning for the camera in front of this very building. "David Glickman was my best friend," he said, a wistful fondness softening his reedy voice. "We were inseparable. He was a kind boy, a clever boy. He taught me a few words of German. I taught him how to play stickball in the street. His mother, Rachel, she made the most wonderful honey cakes. The smell would fill the whole hallway. He spoke of them not as ghosts from a diary, but as living, breathing people, his words painting them in vibrant color." The old man's face clouded over, the pleasant memory dissolving into a shadow of ancient pain. They were good people. They had escaped a nightmare. And they were so happy to be here, to be safe. Samuel, his father, was a good man, a craftsman. He worked so hard to build a new life for them in the shop downstairs. He paused, taking a shaky sip of his tea, but he made one mistake. He trusted the wrong man. He trusted Alistair Finch. He said the name with a quiet, venomous disgust that had not faded over 80 years. Finch was all smiles and handshakes, but he had the eyes of a jackal. He was jealous. He saw Samuel's skill, and he coveted what Samuel had managed to save from the fire in Europe. I was only a boy, but even I could feel the coldness from him. I told David to be careful of him, but what did we know? We were just children. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, the story he had held inside for a lifetime finally breaking free. I remember the night it happened. It was February, cold. There was a storm. "Like the one starting now," he said, gesturing with a trembling finger towards the window, where the first drops of rain were beginning to streak the glass. I was supposed to meet David to trade comic books, but I was late. When I got to his landing, there were two black cars parked outside. Men in dark suits and hats were on the stairs. They were with Alistair Finch. I saw him. He pointed directly at the Glickman's door, his face like stone. The men went in, and I heard Rachel cry out, just once. The memory was so vivid, so raw, that Helen felt the cold of that night seep into her own bones, the sound of that cry echoing in her ears. Mr. Elias's eyes were glassy with unshed tears, his mind adrift in the sea of the past. I was so scared. I ran and hid in a linen closet on the landing. I pulled the door almost shut and watched through the crack. I was there for hours, too terrified to move, barely daring to breathe. They brought them out. Samuel, then Rachel, then my friend David. They weren't in handcuffs, but the men walked so close to them, their faces grim. David looked so small and so frightened. He looked right at the closet where I was hiding, but he didn't see me. They took them down the stairs and put them in the cars, and then they were gone. He choked on a sob, a dry, racking sound of ancient grief. They just drove away, and I never saw my friend again. They vanished from the earth. The personal testimony, the eyewitness account, made the crime real in a way the diary never could. After the cars were gone, the building fell silent. But Mr. Elias remained hidden, a small boy, paralyzed by a terror too large for him to comprehend. "I stayed in that closet until the sun came up," he continued, his voice thin and strained. "Sometime in the middle of the night, Alistair Finch came back. He was alone this time. He used a key to let himself into the Glickman's empty apartment. He was in there for a long time. When he came out, he was carrying Samuel's leather briefcase. I remember the look on his face in the light of the hall lamp. It was not a look of patriotic duty. It was the look of a thief, a grave robber. This was it, the final damning piece of the puzzle, the proof of the crime, seen through the eyes of a terrified child who had become its sole living witness. The briefcase must have held the shop's ledgers, deeds, and any remaining assets Finch could find. Helen felt a profound sense of clarity amidst her fear. The story was no longer just hers and Samuel's. It now belonged to Mr. Elias, too. His testimony was the living link, the bridge across 80 years of silence and injustice. She looked at the old man, his frail body trembling with the effort of confession, and felt an overwhelming wave of gratitude and protective fierceness. He had carried this burden his entire life, the secret poisoning his memories. "Why didn't you ever tell anyone?" she asked softly, already knowing the answer. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a lifetime of fear. "My parents knew I saw something. They told me to be silent. They said the Finches were powerful people. They said we were just poor tailors, and that if I spoke, something terrible would happen to our family too. So I kept quiet, for survival, but I never forgot. I have lived with the ghost of my friend every single day. Just as he finished speaking, the lights in the apartment flickered violently, casting the room in a series of strobing, surreal flashes. Bella cried out in alarm. Then, with a low hum, the power died completely, plunging them into an almost absolute darkness, punctuated only by the increasingly bright flashes of lightning from the growing storm outside. The sudden blackout was terrifying, unnatural. It wasn't the gentle fade of a neighborhood outage. It felt deliberate, malicious. Helen's blood ran cold. The building, deprived of its weak, buzzing lifeblood, fell into a deep, groaning silence, a silence that was immediately more menacing than the noise had been. A low, rhythmic boom echoed from the street below. A crash. It was the sound of the heavy front door being forced open, the iron giving way with a tortured screech of metal. "He's back," Mr. Elias whispered, his voice a thread of pure terror in the darkness. The old man's face, illuminated for a second in a brilliant flash of lightning, was a mask of waxy, primordial fear. The past was not just repeating itself, it was coming to claim them all. Helen's mind went into overdrive, the paralyzing fear replaced by a surge of pure, desperate adrenaline. Finch wasn't making threats anymore. He was done waiting. He had come to take what he believed was his. A new sound began, a sound that confirmed her worst fears. The heavy, syncopated tread of multiple people, more than one, starting up the main stairs. They weren't trying to be quiet. Their steps were heavy, deliberate and confident. The sound of thugs who knew they had nothing to fear. The sound of wolves climbing toward the fold. Helen didn't need to be told what was happening. Her instincts screamed at her. She grabbed the bundled diary and documents. The small velvet bag of uncut diamonds was still in her coat pocket from her earlier frantic gathering. It was all she could carry. "Lucas! Bella! With me now!" she hissed, her voice low and urgent. She grabbed their hands, their small fingers cold and trembling in her own. The footsteps were on the first-floor landing now, pounding their way up and closer. The building seemed to groan under the assault, the old wood protesting their violent ascent. Time seemed to slow down, each heavy footfall a hammer blow against Helen's sanity. They were coming straight for the attic, straight for her. The thought of them finding her children, of them being trapped in that filthy, dark space, was an image from hell itself. Mr. Elias, galvanized into action by the immediate danger, grabbed her arm. His grip was surprisingly strong. "Not the stairs," he rasped, his eyes wide in the gloom. "This way. Hurry." He pulled them away from his apartment door, deeper into the cluttered sanctuary of his home, towards the back. The heavy footsteps reached their landing now, paused for a heartbeat, and then continued upward, their destination clear. They were feet from the attic. A moment later, a deafening crash echoed from above, the sound of the trapdoor splintering under a heavy blow, followed by the shattering of wood. The invasion had begun. They were in the attic, tearing it apart, searching for her, for the treasure. Helen felt a sob of terror catch in her throat, but she swallowed it down, forcing herself to focus. Elias led them to a small kitchen at the rear of the apartment. A single window looked out over a dark, narrow alleyway. Outside, zigzagging down the dark brick wall, was the skeletal, soundless, rusty form of the rear fire escape. The storm was a full-blown tempest now, the wind howling down the alley and the rain coming down in cold, driving sheets. The fire escape looked ancient, precarious, a spider web of rusted iron slick with rain. "It is the only way," Elias whispered, struggling with the old, swollen window frame. "Go, before they realize you are not up there." The window finally gave way with a screech of protest, letting in a blast of cold-ash wet wind that smelled of rain and soot and the metallic tang of the city. The noise from the attic was louder now, a cacophony of destruction, of wood being splintered and objects being thrown. Helen didn't hesitate. The terrifying, swaying fire escape was a better option than facing the men who were destroying their shelter. "Lucas, you first," she commanded, her voice steady despite the frantic pounding of her heart. "Hold on tight. Don't look down." Lucas, his face a pale oval in the darkness, nodded grimly and scrambled out the window, his small hands gripping the cold, wet railing. Helen turned to Bella, whose eyes were wide with terror. "It's a game, sweetie," she lied, her voice shaking. We're explorers on a secret ladder." She helped her daughter through the opening, her heart aching at the child's frightened whimper as the cold rain hit her face. The sounds from the attic were growing more frantic, more violent. They were realizing the space was empty. They would be coming back down. They would be searching the other floors. Helen clutched the precious bundle containing the diary and scrambled out the window after her children, her feet finding a slippery purchase on the narrow metal grating. The wind tore at her, trying to rip her from her perch. The alleyway below was a dizzying chasm of darkness. Elias stood at the window, his frail form silhouetted against the dim light of the room. "My apartment," he called out over the howl of the wind. "Come back to my apartment when you can. Hide. I will lock the door from the inside. They will think I am just a deaf old man." His bravery, his willingness to put himself in danger for them, was a small, flickering candle in the overwhelming darkness. Helen could only nod, her throat too tight with fear and gratitude to speak. She pushed her children forward, urging them down the slick, treacherous steps. Their descent was a vertical nightmare. The iron groaned and swayed under their combined weight with every step. The rain was relentless, plastering their hair to their faces and soaking their thin clothes in seconds, the cold seeping into their bones. Helen kept one hand on the railing and the other firmly on Bella's shoulder, guiding her down, her own body shielding her daughter from the worst of the wind. She could hear voices from above now, angry shouts echoing from the building as the thugs realized their prey had escaped. A beam of a powerful flashlight cut through the darkness, sweeping across the alleyway, narrowly missing them as they huddled against the brick wall. They were being hunted in the middle of a storm, clinging to a rusty relic, with a fortune in secrets clutched in their hands. They scrambled down the final flight, their feet landing with a splash in a deep, garbage-strewn puddle in the alley. For a moment, they were exposed, caught between the menacing wall of the building and the darkness of the narrow street beyond. Helen looked back up. The flashlight beam was sweeping back and forth from an upper window, Elias's window, but it wasn't him. It was the dark silhouette of a large man, leaning out, searching the darkness for them. They had found Elias's apartment. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced Helen's heart for the old man. She grabbed her children's hands and pulled them into the deeper shadows of the alley, pressing them against the cold, wet brick. They had to get away. They had to disappear into the stormy New York night before that beam of light found them. The sound of Elias's window slamming shut echoed down the alley, followed by a muffled shout of anger. They had been seen, or at least their escape route had been discovered. Helen knew they had only seconds. "Run," she whispered, the word a plume of white vapor in the cold air. She pulled her children along, their small legs struggling to keep up as they half ran, half stumbled through the labyrinthine alleyways of the Lower East Side. The rain and wind were their allies now, muffling the sound of their frantic footsteps and cloaking them in the tempestuous anonymity of the storm. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every distant shout seemed to be meant for them. The weight of the diary in her arms was a constant reminder of the reason they were being hunted, a priceless, dangerous truth in a world built on lies. They found refuge in the darkened doorway of a closed bakery, shivering and soaked to the bone. The sweet smell of day-old bread a strange and cruel comfort. Helen held her children close, their shared body heat a pathetic defense against the biting cold. She risked a peek back towards the alley. There was no sign of pursuit, only the chaotic dance of rain in the streetlights. But she knew they weren't safe. Finch would not give up so easily. He had crossed a line, moving from veiled threats to open violence. He had underestimated her once by assuming she would be easily intimidated. He would not make that mistake again. The fear was still a living thing inside her, but it was now tempered with a hard, cold anger. He had threatened her children. He had put them in mortal danger. This was no longer just about a historical injustice. It was a war, and she had just survived the first battle. She looked down at the precious, water-damaged bundle in her arms. Samuel Glickman's last words, Elias's living testimony, the evidence of a crime that had been buried for nearly a century. This was her only weapon. In the cold, wet darkness of a New York City doorway, clinging to her terrified children, Helen made a silent vow. She would not run forever. She would not let Finch win. She would find a way to use this weapon, not just for the ghost of Samuel Glickman, but for the future of her own family. The storm raged around them, a perfect reflection of the turmoil in her heart. But in the center of that storm, a new and unshakable resolve was being forged. The turning point had passed. Now, the fight for redemption would begin. Huddled together in the cold, wet darkness of the bakery doorway, Helen felt the violent trembling of her body finally begin to subside, replaced by a strange and unfamiliar calm. The icy fear was still there, a hard knot in her stomach, but it was now overlaid with a layer of pure, unyielding resolve. The initial animalistic instinct to run, to disappear into the vast, indifferent city, had been burned away by the heat of her anger. He had come for her children. The thought was a single, sharp point of clarity in the chaos. They could not run far enough or fast enough. Arthur Finch would never stop hunting them. Their only path to safety was not through escape, but through confrontation. She looked at the dark, hulking mass of their building down the street, no longer a prison, but a battlefield. She had to get back to Mr. Elias. He was her only ally, the last living link to the truth. The storm, as if sensing her decision, began to relent, the howling wind softening to a mournful sigh. It was their chance. "Stay close," she whispered, her voice a raw, determined rasp. Moving like ghosts through the glistening, rain-slicked alleyways, they retraced their steps, the familiar path now fraught with a new, heightened sense of danger. The building's heavy iron door, a symbol of their initial entrapment, now hung askew from a single hinge, a gaping wound revealing the dark hallway within. The silence inside was absolute and unnerving, a dead vacuum that seemed to amplify the frantic beating of Helen's heart and the soft, terrified padding of her children's wet shoes. They crept up the groaning wooden stairs, each creak and pop of the old structure sounding like a gunshot in the stillness. When they reached the second-floor landing, the cheerful blue of Mr. Elias's door was a beacon in the gloom. Helen raised a trembling hand and gave a soft, three-tap knock, the simple rhythm they had wordlessly agreed upon. An agonizingly long moment passed, a lifetime of suspense, before the distinct, metallic sound of multiple locks being carefully, deliberately undone echoed from within. The door opened a mere crack, revealing Elias's pale, frightened face, and he pulled them inside with a gasp of relief. Once inside the small, warm apartment, with the door once again bolted and chained, a fragile sense of security settled over them. Mr. Elias, though his hands trembled uncontrollably and his face was ashen, was physically unharmed. He explained in a hushed, frantic whisper that Finch's thugs had kicked in his door moments after they had fled, tearing the place apart in a furious search before leaving, apparently satisfied he was just a confused, deaf old man. Without wasting another second, he shuffled over to a small alcove where an ancient black rotary phone sat atop a lace doily. He pulled out a small worn leather address book, its pages filled with the spidery script of a lifetime of contacts. "There is one person," he rasped, his voice filled with a desperate conviction. "A lawyer. From the claims conference. He helped my cousin's family reclaim paintings stolen in Vienna. He understands these things, these long shadows of history. He is the only one I would trust with Samuel's story." His gnarled finger traced a name and number, and he began to dial. The slow, clicking whirl of the rotary dial, a sound from another age, winding up their last, best hope. The conversation was a low, urgent torrent of words, a desperate plea whispered into the heavy black receiver. Mr. Elias spoke with a fire that belied his 92 years, his reedy voice cracking with emotion as he recounted the Glickman name, the diary, the events of that night in 1943, and the violent assault that had just occurred. He switched between English and bursts of impassioned Yiddish, the ancient language adding a profound weight of authenticity and grief to his testimony. Helen stood frozen, watching him, her entire future hanging on the response of a stranger on the other end of the line. She heard Elias say, "The diary is here. His son's best friend is here. The proof is here." There was a long pause, and Helen could feel Elias's hope beginning to fray. Then his face changed. A wave of relief washed over his features. "Yes," he breathed. "Yes, we can. Immediately." He hung up the phone and turned to Helen, his old eyes shining with the first real glimmer of light. "His name is Rosenthal. He will see us now. He said not to move and not to speak to anyone else. He is waiting." The taxi ride through the emptying, rain-swept streets of Manhattan was surreal. The city, usually a roaring beast, was quiet, its lights smearing into long, abstract streaks of neon on the wet windows. Helen held Bella, who had finally fallen into an exhausted sleep, while Lucas sat bolt upright, staring out the window, his young face a mask of solemn maturity. Mr. Elias sat beside her, clutching a small, worn satchel, his posture ramrod straight despite his fragility. He was no longer just a kind old man. He was a witness preparing for his final, most important testimony. The address led them to a stately, pre-war building in a quiet midtown side street. A man was waiting for them under the awning, a stark figure in a dark raincoat. This was Benjamin Rosenthal. He was younger than Helen expected, with sharp, intelligent eyes and a calm, reassuring demeanor that immediately cut through her anxiety. He led them not to a sterile corporate office, but to a private study lined from floor to ceiling with books, the air thick with the comforting, scholarly scent of old paper and leather. It felt less like a lawyer's office and more like a historian's sanctuary. Mr. Rosenthal cleared the surface of a grand, dark mahogany desk. With hands that felt strangely steady, Helen unwrapped the damp bundle and laid its contents out under the warm glow of a banker's lamp. The cracked leather diary, the brittle German documents, the small bag of uncut diamonds. Rosenthal handled each item with a quiet, palpable reverence, his touch gentle, as if he understood he was holding the fragments of a shattered life. He read passages from the diary aloud, his voice low and filled with a controlled anger, the words of Samuel Glickman filling the silent room. He then turned to Mr. Elias. The old man, sitting straight in a leather armchair, recounted the story of that night in 1943, his memory unclouded by the passing of 80 years, his testimony a clear, unbroken thread connecting the past to the present violence. When he finished, the room was heavy with the weight of the crime. Rosenthal didn't hesitate. He picked up his phone and made a single call, not to a local precinct, but directly to a senior litigator in the UAS attorney's office. "David," he said, his voice firm, "I have a case for you. It's a Glickman case, and it's still active." The following morning, sunlight streamed into Arthur Finch's minimalist penthouse office, reflecting off the chrome and glass. He sat behind his vast desk, a portrait of untouchable power, reviewing market reports with a cold, satisfied air. The problem of the attic and its inconvenient occupants had been dealt with. It was just a matter of time before his men reported back with the prize. The quiet hum of his office was broken when his door swung open without a knock. He looked up, his face hardening with annoyance, ready to berate his assistant. But it wasn't his assistant. Standing in the doorway were two grim-faced men in dark suits, their FBI credentials held up for him to see, flanking a composed and resolute Benjamin Rosenthal. "Arthur Finch," one of the agents said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "You're under arrest." Finch let out a short, incredulous laugh, but the sound died in his throat as Rosenthal stepped forward, placing a warrant on the desk. The charges include extortion, witness tampering, and conspiracy related to the theft of Holocaust-era assets. The color drained from Finch's face, his mask of arrogance shattering to reveal a raw primal panic. The sharp, metallic click of the handcuffs was the final sound, a definitive end to his family's century of greed. The arrest was only the beginning. The full weight of the federal government, spurred by Rosenthal's advocacy, descended upon the case. The investigation unraveled the dark tapestry of the Finch family's history, confirming every detail from Samuel's diary and Elias's testimony. The gold bars and the remaining diamonds were logged as evidence, recovered from the secret compartment in the now sealed attic. The legal resolution was complex but righteous. Following federal and international laws on the restitution of Holocaust-era assets, the bulk of the recovered fortune was placed in a trustee, part of it designated for several Holocaust memorial museums, and the other to establish the Glickman Elias Education Fund, ensuring their story would never be forgotten. However, the law also recognized Helen's crucial role. As the legitimate finder who had faced mortal danger to expose the crime, she was awarded a legal and substantial finder's fee. The amount, when it appeared in her new bank account, was a string of zeros that seemed impossible, a figure that not only erased her past, but guaranteed a future of absolute security for her and her children. 6 months later, the attic was a space reborn. The foul and oppressive darkness had been banished, replaced by a flood of brilliant sunlight pouring through a huge, new skylight that offered a panoramic view of the city sky. The grimy, stained walls were now a clean, pristine white, and the filthy floorboards had been replaced with warm, polished hardwood that gleamed in the light. In the corner, where the old chest had hidden its terrible secret, a small modern kitchen had been installed, and the delicious aroma of a roasting chicken filled the air, a scent of home and abundance. The terrifying tangle of wires was gone, and soft, recessed lighting gave the room a gentle glow. Helen sat at a sleek new sewing machine, its quiet, efficient hum a comforting sound. She was no longer mending rags. She was creating a beautiful dress from a bolt of deep blue silk. Across the room, Lucas and Bella sat at a sturdy wooden table, laughing as they worked on a school project, their faces relaxed and free from the shadows of fear and hunger. This was not a shelter. This was home. Helen paused her sewing and walked to the large, clean window, looking out over the sprawling rooftops of the Lower East Side. The city, which had once felt like a predatory monster ready to devour her, now looked like a place of vibrant, endless possibility. Her gaze fell upon the worn leather diary, which now sat in a place of honor on a bookshelf, next to a photograph of a smiling Mr. Elias. She thought of Samuel Glickman, not with the pity of a stranger, but with the quiet gratitude of a friend. By unearthing his tragedy, she had not only delivered a long-overdue justice to his ghost, but she had forged a new life for her own family from the crucible of his pain. Her world, once shrunk to the size of $500 desperate dollars, was now as wide as the future she could give her children. The story of one mother's desperate fight reminds us that even in the darkest of attics, justice can find a way to the light. If you were moved by Helen's journey from despair to redemption and want to hear more stories of incredible resilience and hidden truths, make sure you subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. You won't want to miss what we uncover next.